Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to today's Tuesday Times Roundtable. Today's session is about GlobalHER, a dialogue on transnational feminism and International Women's Day. My name is Janery Mendoza-Farjan, and I am the Senior Program Coordinator at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. The TTR is the Office of Global Learning flagship discussion series that brings together multiple perspectives on global issues and trends. And you may learn more about TTR by going to go.fiu.edu/TTR. As a reminder, you may sign in just to get credit as a Global Learning Medallion student or Honors College, or if you're here also for extra credit from your professor. Just make sure that you do the sign in. We have the QR code in the screen again. Hey, also a friendly invitation to all of you to learn more about the application process for the Peace Corps program. We're going to be having an event this Thursday from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock where the Peace Corps recruiter will be coming over to go over the process. Feel free to RSVP by going to go.fiu.edu/PC service event or scanning the QR code on the screen. We'll be happy to have you all. Also a reminder that next week we're going to have our annual visit from the New York Times Speaker Series. Jordan Holman, she's going to be joining us on a session on all-consuming retail technology and the attention economy. It's going to be hosted here also in GC 150 at 12:30. And TTR, as you know, is always linked to a New York Times article just to continue the discussion. So if you would like to read the article for this week, we have it at go.fiu.edu/TTR0304. This is because everyone with an FIU email address gets free digital access. So you may activate your account at accessnyt.com. Also, today's session connects with SDG number 5, gender equality. And then if you would like to learn more about this SDG, including the target, the indicators, and also the progress on the goal, you may go to go.fiu.edu/SDGs. All right, and now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator. We do have a panel, and Dr. Emily Anderson is also joining us via Zoom. So we ask you that as you connect to the session, you please raise your hand so we can get you the microphone. That way she can also hear you in her end as well. This is the only way for us to be able to stay connected in a hybrid setting. And today's moderator is Tiffany Peacock. So Tiffany, she is the program coordinator for the Women's Center in the Centers for Student Engagement. She's a PhD candidate in the Joint Program for African and African Diaspora Studies and Global Sociocultural Studies with a focus on sociocultural anthropology. Tiffany is currently working on her dissertation project that addresses topics within the politics of hair and beauty, identity construction, processes of racialization, transnational feminism, aesthetics, representation, and body politics within the U.S., Caribbean, Latin America, and the African diaspora. So let's welcome Tiffany and the panel.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I will also, within our presentation, introduce the additional panelists. So today's topic is going to be on GlobalHER, a dialogue on transnational feminism and International Women's Day. So a little bit about the purpose for this panel. So GlobalHER will be a dialogue on transnational feminism and International Women's Day, and it will offer a reflection on the day itself, its significance, and its impact for women globally, while opening a discussion for addressing the ways that women's rights struggles continue to take shape across borders, national contexts, cultures, and communities. Although struggles for women's rights are improving within some nations, many women across others continue to struggle for the same recognition, gender equalities, and access to economic and political power as their male counterparts. Additionally, this discussion will address the role of patriarchy and increasing conservatism in pushing the needle back for women's rights globally. And so joining me in this discussion today is going to be Dr. Emily W. Anderson. Dr. Anderson works as an associate professor of international and intercultural education at Florida International University. Her scholarship, service, and teaching thinks about the relationships between girls, education, and women's empowerment and is shared widely through peer-reviewed journals, books, chapters, proceedings, presentations, and visual media. Dr. Anderson is also a former co-chairperson of the Gender and Education Standing Committee of the Comparative and International Education Society, which is CIES, and is a founding member of its advisory board. So please welcome Dr. Emily Anderson. We are also joined today by Subhami Babawale. Subhami is a second-year PhD student in the Global Sociocultural Studies program focusing on anthropology. Subhami's research interests include African visual art, African female artists, gender, race, representation, and the African diaspora. Subhami is interested in transnational multidisciplinary studies on issues that sit at the crossroads of race, gender, and sexuality, transnational feminism, and the African diaspora. So please welcome Subhami. So to kind of begin our conversation, I wanted to just kind of start off by really talking about just the significance or even the conceptualization of what International Women's Day is. So directly from the website, so International Women's Day has been around for over 100 years, as has many of the various issues that are still impacting women's advancement. So since 1911, International Women's Day, it belongs to all who care about women's equality. It celebrates women's achievements, and it raises awareness about discrimination while taking action to forge gender parity. So I'm really thinking about this. So for brief history, so March 8th is now the recognized day of International Women's Day, and that is celebrated in various countries around the world, and that this day is really recognizing those achievements across various social identities, including national, ethnic, linguistics, cultural, economic, and the political. But it also has a very powerful history of various collective action with many groups, countries, and bodies who have actively contributed to its evolvement and progress today. And so International Women's Day, it originated from the labor movements that were taking place within Europe and North America during the beginning of the 20th century, and that the earliest version of an International Women's Day was seen as Women's Day, and that this was being marked within New York City on February 28th. So March 8th wasn't officially declared as International Women's Day until 1922. And this was to honor women's roles within the Russian Revolution in 1917, and then the UN, which is the United Nations, officially adopted the holiday in 1977. So really thinking about that significance, so the first International Women's Day, where it was celebrated by over 1 million people, happened on March 19th, on 1911, in Austria, Hungary, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. So I wanted to kind of start off with just highlighting that significance, as well as just how International Women's Day really came to be throughout the 20th century and even today, to really just provide how it's a central focal point when really thinking about various women's rights movements across the globe, and that it gives attention to the different issues across thinking about gender equality, reproductive rights, and also gender-based violence. So in thinking about this narrative, the first question that I have for our panelists, what does International Women's Day mean to you? When did you first learn about it? And how do you celebrate the day each year?
Hi. So for me, International Women's Day is a day to celebrate all women across all borders, regardless of where they come from. It's also a day to celebrate the ordinary woman just surviving. And when I first learned about International Women's Day was through social media, I believe a couple years back, and I followed like some pages, and since then I just keep up. In terms of how I commemorate the day each year, I like to paint, and what I do is I immortalize the memories of the women that have inspired me in my life, as well as women I see in my interactions. And I do that through painting. I believe by putting a lot of energy and time and devotion in my pieces, I can somewhat, highlight the experiences of these women and show my dedication through my craft, how much they've inspired me. So that's how I do it. And also just following pages, reading up on stories of women, how they've broken barriers to get through certain stages in their life and to elevate their careers as well. Thank you.
I'm happy to follow up. Thank you so much again, colleagues, for this wonderful opportunity to be in celebration and acknowledgement with you today. So I love this question. What does International Women's Day mean? And so for me, I'll sort of couple my responses to these questions, if that's okay. So the first time I remember having an awareness of International Women's Day was as a graduate student. And so my background is in girls' education within international development. And so I had the opportunity as a graduate student to participate in the Commission of the Status of Women meetings, which happen or convened annually in New York City at the UN's headquarters every year, where millions of people that are interested in these kinds of conversations gather to talk about the role of INGOs and civil society within the United Nations work. And so through that exposure, I was really invited into conversations that helped me to think through issues of importance related to my scholarship, but also what it means to be a woman in the world. And so by observing, engaging, documenting, creating around the idea of this question, what does International Women's Day actually mean? It helped me within a global context. It helped me to see the relationships between ideas like transnational feminism, which I know is one of our major concepts in conversation this afternoon, but also how we see ourselves and each other in that work as allies, as co-journeyers or co-travelers. And so that was a very, very formative moment for me, not only as an academic, but a woman who was curious about the relationships between education and everything else. And so each year I sort of try to reflect on what I know and what I don't know about those ideas. And like my colleague on the panel, I'm a maker of things. I'm an artist. And so for the last few International Women's Days, I've convened a craft up, which is an extension of my research project. That fun fact was launched at Tuesday Times Roundtable 2 years ago. And so it's a bit of a full circle moment for me to get to reflect on that experience as part of our time together today. And so this year I plan to continue that work. I'm wearing the shirt that I always wear for International Women's Day, and also will be making things on Saturday as I reflect and ponder what it means to do this work in this moment.
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate and thank both of you for offering those responses and really highlighting just the different ways that not only you are creating, but also contributing to the meaning of the day for yourselves and also with others. These questions really come from just not always knowing about International Women's Day. And I know that both of you both noted that as me as well. Like, I feel like I didn't really fully know about International Women's Day until a couple years ago myself, like as a graduate student as well. So I actually, like, that's where this question is coming from. So I appreciated those answers and that it really just pinpoints the fact how there's many things about just how women are not only advocating for their rights globally, but within their specific communities and contexts, and how spreading or just engaging more conversation about them is what increases that awareness. And so this next section just really walks us into the article that is grounding this conversation for today. So the article is titled, On International Women's Day, Avoiding the Patriarchy Trap, which The Interpreter. So this article is citing a scene from The Interpreter / The Americans. And so Amanda Taub, who is the author, highlights how patriarchy thrives on women continuing to support the traditional hierarchy of positioning men in the most powerful and privileged positions, to protect women from being vulnerable and without protection in society. So this article, for those who haven't had a chance to read it, the exact scene that she is citing is, I'll go ahead and I'll read it for everyone so that we can also think about and talk through it together. So in this scene, it begins with Nina Krivlova, who is played by Anit Mahindru, a young employee of the Soviet embassy in Washington, perusing apples at a farmer's market when Stan Beeman, Noah, who was played by Noah Emmerich, an FBI agent, sidles up next to her. Speaking softly, he informs her that he knows she is trading stolen embassy caviar for electronics to sell on the black market back in Russia. Now he tells her she must become an FBI mole or he'll report her crimes and have her sent to a Siberian prison camp. The camera holds Nina's face for a few agonizing seconds, fear and anger flickering across her features as she tries to think of a way out of this trap. But she can't. A minute earlier, she had a promising young official with a minor sideline in victimless crime. Now, she is a traitor whose only hope is that Stan will protect her from discovery and certain execution. In other words, it's not just that she is aiding the enemy. To stay safe, she needs to make sure that he keeps the same power and privilege that he used to put her in a subordinate, vulnerable position, and that this dynamic continues to play out for those of you who have continued to watch The Americans over 3.5 seasons, with profound but unequal consequences for the two characters. So I read out this scene because it really sets into the next question, and one that Amanda Taub really poses within the article itself. In that, what do you think about the presence of patriarchy in creating an environment where, in order to protect women from being vulnerable and without protection in society, that gender progress is increasing, yet at the same time is being stalled? So I asked this question to just kind of allow our panelists to reflect on not only the scene, but just how this process really plays out, like every day or over time within our society.
Hi. In regards to this question, I do agree that in recent times, definitely there's been progress, but even though there's been progress, we still have like some things to get through. For instance, when it comes to gender equality, there's this framing that women need protection rather than autonomy. And it sort of shifts the responsibility maybe onto men or even institutions, but it still doesn't address the systemic inequalities. So I believe that true progress is not just like providing selective protections and still somewhat maintaining male dominance. Even in recent times too, another issue that we're having is even as some women are breaking barriers, it still masks the struggles of some other women who don't have access to certain resources. So we do have women that are doing things and they're at the forefront, but then also we've seen a rise in like misogynistic digital spaces and reactionary like politics. So while women are rising in the ranks, you still have people that are coming up and are upset at that. Maybe they don't, and there's still this sort of clash, this sort of tension. So for each time we make some level of progress, there's still like we take some steps back. But I believe that, true change isn't just going to happen in one day. And when we even have to look across cultures, traditions, there's a lot to uncover. So I think we're making steps. And in the age of social media, we're able to make people more aware of the impacts on women all around the world. Like people have access to videos, they have access to short videos, like you have TikTok, all sort of things, and they can see what's going on globally. They can just turn a blind eye. And through that, I think we're slowly making some changes that were much more difficult to make back then without technology. But it's still like a double-edged sword. So I guess in some ways, is trying to figure out if we can find this balance. I'm not sure if we ever truly will, frankly, but I'm glad that I'm a woman in this generation because the previous women have paved the way for us to get to where we are now. And we're going to pave the way for the next generation of women to be in better positions. So I think it's just acknowledging the fact that there are steps that we still have to make and also being aware that we've made more progress than in the past. So. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Your comments really, really helped to clarify the importance of this question or confirm the importance of this question for me, particularly in thinking about how the idea of progress is sort of embedded into, more of a developmentalist discourse that places girls in a unique and distinctly vulnerable position. And so I can speak to this question in a couple of ways. So first of all, I love the idea, and that Anna in the article really gives us a great example of, is how we thinking about the media that we consume, and how that then helps us to understand issues like the ones that we're speaking of today. The Americans is a great show. I've seen that episode, and it gave me a want to rewatch that. So maybe I'll do that as part of my celebrations and acknowledgments for this Saturday. So one of the things that I really love about this question, and thanks again to Tiffany for posing it so thoughtfully, is this idea of gender progress. And so when we think about the idea of progress, all of the ideas for me in my scholarship, the idea of progress is something that deserves to be kind of challenged. And so when we consider the idea of progress, it's all wrapped up in this modernity project, right? Where we assume that sort of the globalization of institutions and systems leads us to something that's, quote unquote, better than whatever was quote unquote before. And so I think that we have an opportunity to be really mindful of how we situate gender within this idea of progress. And so knowing too that for so many of us, our orientation to International Women's Day is really wrapped up in how the UN celebrates and acknowledges it. And so as Tiffany so rightfully shared, International Women's Day precedes the UN's co-optation of it in the 70s. But I think we can credit the UN in doing one of the things that it does really well, is that it continues to keep conversations about, in this case, girls. We can have a parallel conversation to International Day of the Girl, which we celebrate and acknowledge in October. But the UN does a great job in continuing to keep conversations about girls and women at the forefront of its work. And so as we're at this moment where there's a rise in authoritarianism and nationalism, across and between countries and nations, that we know that limits to academic freedom are part of that erasure, which is also part of this idea of the progress project, right? Where we decide at any given point what we understand as modern or good or better, or what our task is as a collective. And so within that, I think a lot about, within this sort of progress idea, I think a lot about vulnerability. And so when we're thinking about the ways in which that girls and women, so as you can tell from me, I do not separate girls and women. For me, it's girls and women and girls, for lots of reasons that maybe we can talk about later in this conversation. But the idea of vulnerability for women and girls matters. And it matters in the ways that we think about what progress is and what we're working towards and for. And so in this moment where what women and girls say, what women and girls do, what we can wear, how we can love, who we can work and learn with, is all sort of up for grabs. It gives us this moment to think about this risk calculation. So in our conversation today, as I was preparing and reflecting on what my contribution would be, I was really situated in this idea of calculated risk. And so while we might not think about the conversation that we're having as particularly political, I think we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that. And so all of us in speaking today, and even those of you who are attending, are taking a particular risk. And that's what the job of the Academy is, right? Is to think about how we move past sort of what has been, and also be in the moment to question the future that is available to us. So in girls' education, I think a lot about this idea of quick wins. And so a quick win, like seemingly easy things that you can kind of do in the minute that make a big difference, make up the majority of what the work in girls' education is in comparative international development context. And so I think about the idea of how do we move past these quick wins that really show up in these progress metrics, right? How do we move past that to sustain these other commitments that are really related to gender justice, that are relational, that are political, that are cultural, that are institutional? And all of those aspects are available to us. We can touch them, we can see them. They're material in our real everyday lives. And so in thinking about, the question, the prevalence of patriarchy in creating this environment, I think that we would have to also acknowledge is that there is always risk and there is always power. And if we don't acknowledge the power and also the vulnerability that it takes to engage in even the thinking, then we miss an opportunity to really do, I think, the work that is required of us. And so I appreciate the question, and also to the opportunity to be in conversation about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both of your responses. Yeah, absolutely, especially with the themes around gender progress, as well as really thinking about those calculated risks for those who are here with us and those who came before us, as even they were even pushing forth their movements. I think those are important pieces for everyone to keep in mind throughout this conversation. And so it actually walks us into just really the significance and the connection between International Women's Day and transnational feminism. So, transnational feminism is a little bit of a new or growing theoretical approach within, I would say, women's studies and gender theory. In that transnational feminism, so in thinking about the transnational, this can be a process of moving different ideas, goods, people, and cultures across national borders, boundaries, communities, and cultures. This approach seeks to destabilize notions that women around the world share similar experiences and oppressions. A transnational approach explores these differences and equalities between women to understand the gender issues that are happening across social identities. And so depending on one's framework, one's lens, or even like the work that you're doing, this process of really engaging in that transnational, it can look different. And so this is actually, I guess, part of just the conversation itself about the strengths, the challenges, and even just the experiences of engaging in this type of lens or engaging in this type of work. And so transnational feminism, it began to increase as an approach during the 1990s through the cresting around third wave feminism. So if you remember, third wave feminism, it really aimed to voice the perspectives and challenges for various women of color across race, class, ethnicity, and sexuality through that intersectional lens. And so third wave feminism, I know within like the U.S. context, was preceded by the case of Anita Hill in terms of looking at sexism within the workplace. But also it was going on around conversations with postmodernism, post-colonialism that was happening globally. So really the theory developed in a response to what gave us intersectionality or that intersectional lens to address these challenges and issues that women within the global south and international context faced as compared to women within global north or within western context that weren't necessarily being centered or highlighted across the world. And so to kind of ground this conversation and really thinking about that transnational approach and how it's all shaped by our unique experiences as well as our various social connections to our understandings of how not only we show up within our communities but also how others are perceiving us and treat us because of that gender component. Can you each share more about what factors shapes and influences your ideas about gender roles and expectations?
Thank you for the question. So there are many factors that shape and influence my ideas about gender roles and expectations. And just like you brought up, talking about looking through a transnational feminism framework, you have to look through borders, cultures, nations, and every woman's experience is sort of unique depending on when you add all those factors together. So I'll probably first bring up my cultural background. Like a lot of cultures across the world, obviously, there's some elements of expectations about traditional gender roles. So I sort of had that home environment, but I also had like a modern home environment where my family kind of pushed for education regardless of gender. Because in my maternal grandmother, like in her era, I say like it was a little bit tougher when girls were able to, when parents had to send their children to school, they would prefer to send the boys to school as opposed to sending the girl child because they felt that the girl child would marry into another man's family, so they prefer the boy child. But now, through that, she started like a business, even though she couldn't really go to school the way she would have liked. And she established this business, and she actually called it the Freedom Project. I thought it was pretty interesting, yes. And she started this tailoring business, like she was a seamstress. She hired a lot of like apprentices, and they were all young girls, and she taught them how to make clothes and set up their own businesses, and then she gave them like a certificate when they were done and recognized their efforts. So that way, even though the girls were not able to get formal education, even if they would end up getting married thereabout, and this is when maybe the 60s or what, they were at least able to, set up businesses or even help manage certain household affairs. They weren't that, completely just immersed in just traditional gender roles without not being able to do other things. And in terms of what has also shaped and influenced my ideas, I would say my educational background. So in high school, I went to a boarding school. And in boarding school, I met people from different cultures, different households, and they would tell me maybe somebody's house, like their dad does the cooking or something. And that kind of changes like your take on things. Maybe for some other people, they share certain household duties, that kind of thing. And school and friendships as well have also influenced my ideas about gender roles and expectations. I have personally done schooling like in 2 different continents, so that has also shaped my own thinking, just kind of learning from other people through their own cultures, their own background. It has impacted my own view on what really is gender role, like what is gender expectation? Does it have to be defined? Does it have to be set in stone? So all those things have played a role, and obviously the way I see the world as well when I bring everything together. So yeah, thank you.
Oh my goodness, so much richness there. And so I'll echo sort of the importance of the women in my life helping me to understand my place in the world. And so I'm a 3rd generation educator from Western North Carolina. And so for me, teaching was work that white women from the South were allowed to do. And so my family was, I think, kind of different than my mother and my aunt described sort of their peers, in that we were there have always just been women in our household. So they were raised by their mother and their aunts in the same house, and everyone was a teacher. And so while that was a bit complicated for my mother and my aunt, having your aunties and be at school and at home teaching you math and then telling you to wash the dishes, it also really was instructional for me growing up with that as a legacy. And so in my family, where, particularly in a time and place where a lot of women were not necessarily women from small towns were not necessarily encouraged to go to college, or if they were encouraged, that finances were an issue. That was not the case for my mother and my aunt. And so they were able to access higher education, both in service to becoming teachers, which notably was not what they would have chosen for themselves, which is kind of ironic in that it is what I chose for myself. But it provided this access and opportunity towards economic and social mobility, which is one of the things, or that sort of bucket or that pathway between access, opportunity, and mobility is something that comes across in my work, and I think in the girls' education scholarship more generally, particularly when we talk about girls' education in a comparative and international context. And so for me, I was able to have this reference, right, that women went to school and they worked in the public service. And so those things coupled together really shaped my understanding about what work is, what public service means, and how education can be this transformative institution that can enable those that access can enable opportunity, can enable mobility. But we know that those things are never enough and always too much, right? They're never enough of what we need at the time, and perhaps sometimes always too much when we get it. So for me, who did not have the sort of economic stability that my mother's generation did, going to college became this pathway that would allow me to have a good job. So, I had sort of a different experience, I think, than I always come to find myself as in this different moment where I studied education, but I didn't go to high school. I dropped out when I was 15. And so much of the myth about what education is supposed to do in the lives of girls and women was something I saw through other people's experiences, but I didn't necessarily see in my own, not until I went to college. And so when I went to college, I saw like, oh my goodness, if I study education, it gives me the opportunity to also study sociology, anthropology, political science. I can study biology. I can study, how the world comes together and splits apart. And that's one of the most beautiful things about education as a field, is that we're not a discipline. And so as I trained to be a teacher and then, began my career as a classroom educator, it then allowed me to think differently about what the purpose of education is, not only as a vocation, but what it means really in the lives of girls and women. And so as soon as I realized that being a professor was something that I could do, it's how I thought about what my career trajectory relative to my education would be. And it's the reason I was sort of interested in doing education work is because I think for a long time, as evidenced by sort of the career opportunities of my great aunties and my mother and my aunt, is that they were able to access economic stability. And so I saw teaching as a job that would allow me to contribute in the public sphere, right? And that would allow me to be curious and get paid for it. And so those things, whether or not they're real, were things that guided my decision making in the ways that I not only thought about gender, but how I thought about how gender would affect, would it shape, would influence what my opportunities would be and were. And so in addition to that, friendships, I think, have played, and to my colleague's point, friendships, I think, between and amongst women provide such a groundedness, a home place, a safe place for curiosity. And so even now, when we're in a moment where some of the ideas that we might have, 4 or 5 years ago taken for granted, in terms of girls' access to education internationally. As a short anecdote, when I was writing my dissertation many years ago, one of my professors said to me, "Emily, well, gender's done." I just want to let that breathe for a minute. The idea of gender was done. Not in the way that we might understand transformational understandings of gender or gender justice, where we're really challenging the binary construction of identity and opportunity, but more that girls are in school worldwide, so that's the thing we should care the most about. And so now that we see a lot of those sort of access-oriented policies that really came from large-scale development agenda like the SDGs, which were mentioned in the top, that really came from a whole set of other benchmarks and goals through the Millennium Development Goals that preceded the SDGs. We know that a lot of those access, sort of taken for granted wins are being withdrawn and also rescinded. So this question gives us another way to think about where we see influence and understanding in the ways in which that we understand gender in our own lived experiences, and how we then disrupt those inequality pushbacks in our own spheres of influence.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I appreciate you both for sharing more about your experiences and even describing for all of us like what it was like growing up, knowing what it was that either young girls or even as a woman, like what opportunities were in front of you or what you could or couldn't do just based off of just the women who are already currently in your life and either other family members who are also interacting and contributing to that. So thank you. So then the next two questions is really just asking more about that transnational feminist approach. So the first one, in what ways do a transnational feminist approach show up within your work? And could you also talk a bit more about what are the successes and the complexities of engaging in a cross-national, cross-cultural, and cross-ethnic analysis?
Thank you for the questions. So for the first question, part of my research is on African female artists and the transnational visual artistic reproduction of Black female artists. So one way that transnational feminist approach shows up in my work is I look at how art serves as a feminist resistance across borders. So I kind of look into how African female artists use visual storytelling to challenge gender-based oppression, even political injustice, colonial histories. Also, I explore economic and institutional gatekeeping. essentially looking at how African female artists navigate the exclusions they face when it comes to getting global recognition in their artworks, because they have to break through big galleries. They have to get access into these galleries. Like who are the curators they have to speak with, the owners they have to speak with to get their works out there. And another thing I'm trying to do is to highlight intersectionality in terms of artistic expression, kind of looking into how these artists address race, gender, and even economic inequalities in their work, as well as how they're able to bridge the diaspora, even Western artistic spaces, and share their struggles and their experiences, as well as their unique cultural expressions through visual storytelling in their art. Now, for the second question, in terms of the successes and the complexities of engaging in cross-cultural, cross-national, and cross-ethnic analysis, I'll say one thing is my work is trying to bring attention to the artists that are often overlooked and to amplify their voices, kind of give them or allow them to show agency through their work, as well as to bridge both local and global feminist dialogues using art as like that bridge. And then in regards to like the complexities and the challenges, it's kind of trying to figure out how, even through my own study or work that I'm trying to do, I don't homogenize the experiences of these women or even their histories, their cultural expression, because, if we're exploring it through a transnational feminist framework, they all have different cultures, different nations, different borders. So I want to make sure they're their own individuals, as well as in navigating the power imbalances in art. Just kind of trying to figure out how, if the global market prioritizes a certain framework in how they want these artists to present their work to like the media or just out there in the world. So yeah, thank you.
I just want to read what you're writing and see what you're making. So hopefully there'll be a follow-up opportunity for us all to sort of share our creative work in progress, because your work it's so important and it's so necessary. And so I applaud you in it and want to hear all the things more and see all the things more. I'll follow up on that wonderful response in sort of thinking about. So when I think about transnational feminism, I think about it as essential, right? And so if we I'm grounding my response here about what it means to study girls' education in the United States right now. And so why transnational feminism is so important to me as a scholar is because it reminds us that struggles are not new and they are not isolated. And so one of the things that I draw comfort from in my work is really learning from the experiences of writers who are scholars, activists, artists who are working outside of the U.S. context, who have been in a different kind of relation with colonialism, who have been in a different kind of relation with the systems around gender inequality and violence that we are all affected by, but their proximity to those effects is a lot closer in many ways than I experience in my daily life as a white lady born and raised in the U.S., teaching in the U.S., living in the U.S. And so I think a lot about in this moment the idea of, I'm thinking about how what's happening in the U.S. is not new, and it's new. Maybe it's new to us in this particular, amplification and velocity, but it's not new in lots of places all around the world. And so in this moment, I'm thinking about Modi. I'm thinking about what's going on and has been going on in India, for the last 30 years. That is really instructive for how scholars in the U.S., I think, for those of us who study gender and education, are really making sense of this moment. And so I'll also sort of couple that idea with this idea, with the other idea of discursive empowerment. And so one of the ways that dominant developmentalist discourses that are really embedded in the way that the United Nations understands and then activates International Women's Day is sort of tucked into this idea of linearity. And so it assumes that there's a direct relationship between, as I sort of previewed in my previous comment, the idea of butts and seats, having girls have a school to go to and then being able to go to school as the indicator of progress. And so what we know, and from our larger conversation, we can that our larger conversation today sort of reveals, is that it's way more complicated than that. And so when we're thinking about what our work is, again, in this moment, and how we learn from and along with the stories of writers, activists, artists that are in different proximity to what might feel like a brand new set of scary challenges in the US, I'm grounded in that. I'm grounded that transnational feminism and womanisms gives me a different way to interrogate the problem that we're facing right now, problems that we're facing in education right now, and also my role as a scholar in them. And so the idea of that the dominant discourse around the relationship between gender equality and women's empowerment, which is what SDG 5 is talking about, doesn't tell the whole story. And so in these moments, it gives us a chance to sort of uplift the complexity of not only the discourse, but what we do with those understandings in real time and with futurity in mind.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And so then our next section is really discussing just women's rights struggles across the globe. So again, just really spotlighting how, as we're thinking about like the significance about International Women's Day, and even whether you are or you aren't engaging within that transnational approach, or really thinking through like how women are advocating for themselves, to really consider just the ways that women are trying to improve their social conditions by struggling for that same access, equalities, and economic resources as was given to their male counterparts. And as I read through this slide, it reminds me of the responses that both panelists gave in really thinking about those different gender roles and gender expectations, and how it really does it plays into the different experiences that women have, but also in the ways that women are engaging within their experiences of struggle and advocacy for specific rights, experiences, or access that may or may not be given to them. And so in thinking about these struggles, one of the biggest points that's taken from the article is really thinking about these increases and shifts of conservatism that's happening across the globe. One of them being the protections against gender-based violence. One example being that in Spain, this happened when thousands of protesters, they took to the streets of Madrid to commemorate International Women's Day, or the elimination of violence against women. They were greeted with a controversial demand from Spain's surging far right called the Vox Party, because the country was planning to repeal a landmark law that aimed at protecting women from violence and citing its unfairness toward men by keeping it in place. In that, the party's Secretary General is quoted saying, "There are also men who suffer violence from women and are killed by their wives." And so women have also suffered, given that there's violence from their lesbian partners. So really thinking about just kind of the response from the nation of Spain, but also how specific political leaders that's happening within the country allows me to really think through just how you have specific individuals who are within these contexts who at one point may have supported certain policies or laws that were in support of women's progress, but are now shifting and changing depending on how they feel it's impacting men, women, or all genders, and wanting to have that same access or that same inclusion. And so the second example is really thinking about access to reproductive health care. We all saw how the access has shifted and it has changed, and it continues to change, even within like our own country. And the fact with Roe v. Wade being repealed after being in place for so many years, from like I think 1972 or 1973, just because of inserting the individual, of thinking of the man's experience and how they view that access to reproductive health care as opposed to the choices that are often given to women and having those decisions for themselves. That's what some of these examples allow me to think about, while also thinking through the increasing involvement as well as election of women as political leaders. It brings me to the example of Mexico, who currently has, who just recently elected their first woman president, although there have been many countries, as well as across the continent of Africa and many others, who already have their women leaders. So thinking through these different sites of struggles or different advocacy that's happening for women as you're advancing in progress, but also, again, there's you take steps forward and take steps back. It drives into this next question, to just really have each panelist consider, what do you believe contributes to women who are continuing to struggle for the same access, equalities, and economic resources globally? And this can be from your own experiences or even in maybe some of the work that you're currently working on today.
Thank you for the question. So I'm actually going to start with two quotes from the article written by Amanda Taub that stood out to me. The first one: when men do out-earn their partners, as they often do, the incentives look different. I've watched many of the high-achieving women I know drift out of workforce after having children because their husband's salaries were much higher. And then the second quote: over time, families can find themselves on a glide path to traditional gender roles, with the male partner's career taking priority and the female partner doing the bulk of housework and childcare, even if she still has a job. So, onto the question. I say, in a way, one thing that still contributes to women's struggle for access to resources, economic resources globally, is the role of institutions, specifically like religious institutions, political institutions. They still perpetuate gender biases, and it still hinders true equality. Another thing too as well is economic disparities, like through the quotes, right? Sometimes women face wage gaps in like certain fields. Like now we've seen a rise, particularly like in STEM fields, or like, in STEM fields like in tech or certain areas where there are more women, but it's still male dominated. And they're still pushing for more women to come in those fields so that, they can see that there's room for them. But there's still this push. Like there's still this tension that's still there. And even with the statistics and all that, it still shows that men still earn high in those fields, and there's still more men in those fields than women. Like even across college campuses, you see clubs trying to advocate for women to and go into like STEM, go into all these places. Like there's room for you. Like you don't have to think you can do it. You see maybe like one or two women in like a computer science or computer engineering class. But we're seeing like some changes here and there. Another thing too, from like a media perspective, since we have access to social media now, we see things all around. We know that not every nation is kind of caught equally in a way. Like when it comes to legal decisions, some women in certain areas in the world still cannot do things that you can do in the US, for instance. Even when you bring in like religion in maybe like certain areas, like there's more restrictions for women to do certain things compared to other people. And even when you play into cultural traditions and kind of modernity, even when these people move to different countries, because it's been ingrained in them, they find it hard to, separate from that identity. Like I've grown up like being told that even if I go to school, I go to work, I still somehow have to submit and do so and so. Like it's kind of hard to separate from that kind of that upbringing. Even though you immerse yourself or you try to acculturate yourself, you still kind of struggle. And another thing I'll also say that contributes to women's struggle for access to, resources is sometimes we don't want to be honest with ourselves. Like in the sense that it's true that we've made some changes, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge, just like I'd mentioned in one of the one of the questions, for each time we make a step forward, there's like some sort of opposition. Like it's like, with podcasts and all these things, and it's like you can make progress as a woman, you can advance career-wise, but it doesn't make you less of a woman. And when it comes to being a woman too as well, it's different for everybody. Like the idea of femininity, the idea of what it means to be a fully accomplished woman for one woman is, different. Just like success is relative for everyone. So, yeah, I'll say that. Thank you.
So thoughtful. I'll try to follow up accordingly. So I'm thinking about, I'm returning back to this idea of progress, right? And so if we if we think about the question that Ms. Taub poses, she asks about, the relationship between gender dynamics and changing gender dynamics and progress. And so if we ground that back in the idea of how at least the United Nations continues to acknowledge and participate and allow and invite our participation in International Women's Day, it's still really oriented around that idea, right? That women's participation per the global goals is really organized in like three specific ways: participation in formal and non-formal labor, number of girls and women in school, so that butts and seats idea, and women's election to national political bodies. Those are the metrics that the United Nations uses to sort of understand what counts as progress. And so for me, I kind of hold fast to Nalia Kabir, she's an economist at the University College London. And her work, I'm thinking of a piece that actually was published 20 years ago this year, kind of wild, where she critiques the third millennium development goal that actually informs what SDG 5 is. It expands it in some ways, contracts in others. But in her critique of MDG 3, she talks about empowerment as this idea of choices within choices. And so for me, that's really instructive, because when I think about when women and girls' choices are limited, that there's really less opportunity for everyone. So, I think that there's some power in that grounding. And that the question then I ask relative to the one that Ms. Taub sort of poses for us in this conversation is that how do we hold or create spaces for women and girls in ways that don't reproduce the same gender violences that hurt all of us, granted in different ways, but that we're all both complicit and affected. So I carry that choices within choices idea, not only in the work that we're engaging in today, but I think across the ways that I think about what the purpose of education is in the lives of girls and women and the opportunities for transformation that it may provide or enable.
Absolutely. And I thank you both for your thoughtful responses and engagement with all the questions that were provided in the presentation. I was given the 5-minute warning, so I will attempt to wrap up. But one of the things I guess that I wanted to end it on, hopefully with a short Q&A for everyone, is in thinking of Amanda Taub's article, that question that she poses is thinking about those changing dynamics, the gender progress that's occurring across national boundaries throughout the world. And so the question is, what do you believe contributes to gender inequality amidst the modern celebrations of International Women's Day? And so
I think a really big contributing factor to, I guess, this kind of regression that we're having a little bit is social media. I feel like there's been a really big rise, not only in conservative values, excuse me, but also just this idea of the traditional wife, the trad wife TikToks. I'm sure you guys have seen them. And I feel like that is just really affecting the way that women are living nowadays, because this idea obviously sounds very nice. You don't have to work, you're just at home and, you have this life where you're being taken care of. But I feel like the reality of that is just so different. Domestic labor is very intense labor, just like if you were having a regular job. And so I think this, I guess this false narrative of, that you can have this life that's very cushy and comfortable, I feel like that is really affecting women, and women are kind of striving to have this lifestyle when it's a fantasy at the end of the day, really. And so I think that's a really big contributing factor.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hi. So thank you so much. Let's give the panel a big round of applause, please. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, for creating so much awareness also on women's rights and also empowering all women as well in this generation. I really like what you mentioned about that we are the ones serving right now for the next generation to come. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, also for joining us. And as a reminder, TTR is going to continue in 2 weeks, but next week we have the New York Times Speakers Series for our annual event. So make sure that you join us at the same time as we welcome Jordan Holman for our New York Times Speaker Series. Hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for coming in today.